Books and Creation Science Ministries present Answers in Genesis. Session number 10, Fossils and the Flood. Featuring internationally recognized author and speaker on the topic of creation versus evolution, Gary Parker.
Well, you've certainly been presented with a lot of evidence of creation at the seminar this evening, and all during the time today and yesterday and so on. If you'd only get your noses out of those Bibles, though, and look over the edge of Grand Canyon, then you'd realize the facts really support evolution after all. At least, that's what I used to say. And as a matter of fact, I thought Grand Canyon was a cure for creationism, and a proof positive that the Bible was a dusty old outmoded book with no more relevance for life today. Now, if you looked in those rock layers in Grand Canyon, you could just see how life began with simple forms of life thrown together by time and chance. How those life forms slowly changed from one kind to another as these rocks were laid down to record stages in evolution over millions of years of time. And of course, that's what a lot of people see when they take a look at Grand Canyon. But I've had a chance to take a look at Grand Canyon again. And as I look at that canyon now, as I look at it through the eyes of Scripture and what's actually found in those rock layers, I begin to see, is there another way to look at this evidence? When we take a look at those fossils in Grand Canyon, are we really seeing simple beginnings? Or are we seeing complex forms well designed to multiply after their kind? And sure enough, you see a lot of fossils there, but were they laid down and formed slowly? Could it have been rapidly? Instead of stages in evolution over millions of years, could we be looking at stages in the burial of different life forms during Noah's flood? A lot of water, not a lot of time. Well, you have to admit, those are certainly two radically different ideas, and we ought to be able to tell the difference by looking at those rocks and fossils right there at Grand Canyon. Well, it's been my pleasure for the past several years to lead, I suppose, about a 15 or maybe more, 15 or 20 different backpacking trips through Grand Canyon. Indeed, it's a regular field study course at Clearwater Christian College, and this May I plan to have another group of students backpacking through that canyon. It really is an awesome place to visit. It's a massive hole in the earth. It's about 10 miles as we stand here at the entrance to the park and looking across from Mather Point to the other side. The North Rim's about 10 miles or 16 kilometers away, and you look down into the depths of the canyon from the rim, a mile deep or over 1.5 kilometers deep, stretched out for 200 miles or 300 kilometers along the length of the Colorado River. It really is an awesome hole in the ground. The sides of the canyon are impressively steep, and so in this one particular location, I like to take the students out, and I go out there first, show them it's okay and so on. You can look straight down over 300 meters or 1,000 feet right down off the ledge to the trails and rocks down below like that. Well, at one point I thought, you know, maybe we ought to try hang gliding. That's really the way to study the canyon. But we decided to do it the old-fashioned way and suit up in backpacks instead. The only bad news about the trip is that it takes about a 45-pound backpack for 5 days and 4 nights in the canyon. In my case, most of the weight's in my camera bag. No matter how many times I've been there, I always shoot I don't know how many rolls of films and take all different kinds of lenses and so on. Fortunately, there's usually a student along in desperate need of extra credit who will carry a few things for me. You might think that hiking down is the easy part, but for some of us with kind of funny knees and so on, the hike down can be really pretty strenuous. You're always skidding into the front of your shoes and your knees take quite a beating and so on. Then hiking up, it's your lungs and your back that take a beating. A couple of girls on the hike one time had the perfect solution, a couple of damp towels that evaporate and cool them off for that trip up. But I have to warn you, it is a dangerous place if you ever go there. Wild animals all over the place. One of the worst of them are the squirrels. So here I was leaning against a rock, you know, tired out, reached around for a little trail mix. Oh, nothing there. I look around, here's one of these squirrels hauling off the whole 2-pound sack of trail mix. Never mind, just a few things. And then there's storms. A friend of mine and I were over there for a week with ICR, and then we stayed later to do some research along the North Rim. And we hiked all the way down across the river, heading up toward the North Rim, and we met a couple of a group on cross-country skis that had come in. We're hiking across the canyon. They said, "Did you hear about the blizzard coming in?" No, we hadn't heard about the blizzard coming in. So the Lord spared us through them. We had to turn around and walk 14 miles all the way back down on the other side to get away from the storm coming in. But of course, the place is made out of rock. The most dangerous thing is that falling rock. And you've got that all over the place. Just let me assure you, this poor hapless fellow here was not a member of our group. Okay? And so we praise God that in all the times we've been there, we've always been able to return safe to the rim, grateful for the protection the Lord has given us on the trip, and grateful for the opportunity to look firsthand at the relationship between God's world and God's Word. So let's take a look at the canyon then, and we can ask three questions about the canyon. We can ask the canyon, how did life begin? Because in the canyon there are some of these rocks that are supposed to be the oldest animals to leave an abundance of fossil record right down there in the bottom of the canyon. So perhaps we can take a look at those rocks and see whether or not life began simple as suggested by evolution, or whether life began complex, well designed to multiply after kind. And the walls of the canyon are loaded with fossils all over the place if you know where to look for them, and we do. And so maybe we can ask, how did those fossils form? Slowly and over millions of years, or could they have formed very rapidly? And what about the rock layers themselves stacked up a mile or a kilometer and a half deep there? Could those be stages in evolution, or is it just possible, as phenomenal as that sounds, that they could be stages in the burial of different environmental zones during the year of Noah's flood? Well, let's take a look first at the kind of things we find as fossils there in the canyon. Well, here's some of the animals whose fossils we find in Grand Canyon. There's all kinds of clams in there, and starfish and sponges and jellyfish. Unfortunately, there may be too many jellyfish. These upside-down starfish, the crinoids, lamp shells, spiny sea urchins, snails, members of the squid and the octopus group, segmented worms, and so on. And so these are a lot of different kinds of animals whose fossils we find there at Grand Canyon. Well, now let's stop and think for a minute. If evolution is true, where would we find fossils of animals like this in the canyon? Well, if evolution were true, fossils of animals like these would have to be found way up in the top of the canyon after millions of years of evolution. After all, these are separate kinds of life. They're complex kinds of life. They're the forms of life that classify into the same groups of animals we find swimming around off the Florida Keys and the Barrier Reef and so on today. That's what evolution would say, but where do we find the fossils of these animals? And the answer is right down there in the bottom of the canyon. The bottom of the flat-lying layers, the so-called simplest community of living things to leave an abundance of fossil remains, the so-called Cambrian geologic system. So when you ask Grand Canyon, how did life begin? With a few simple life forms thrown together by time and chance? The Grand Canyon figuratively shouts back, no, not at all, not if you're looking to me. Life begins with an explosion of diversified and complex life forms. Even evolutionists refer to the Cambrian explosion. There's a video put out by a very well-known evolutionist, and he's looking around in rocks in Morocco, and in here he's finding all sorts of things, all the different kinds of things that live on Earth today in these rock layers, and then he's saying, well, where are the ancestors of these? They should be in the rocks right down below here. And he walks down a few feet and he says, but they aren't there. If you start in the center of the earth and kind of start digging out, you don't find anything, don't find anything, don't find anything, and suddenly, bang, zoom, you find everything. Simple animals? Not at all. This nautilus over here, member of the squid and the octopus group, has an eye that sees the world like we do. That's one of the perplexing things to evolutionists. And so here, you know, when my students dissect kidney and all parts of the intestine and gills, 3 hearts and a whole bunch of other things and so on, the most complex of all of the animals without backbones, and here they are in lowest Cambrian rock in Grand Canyon and also worldwide. One of my personal favorites are these feather stars, these crinoids here. They're an upside-down starfish on a stem. According to evolution, these are those living fossils that Ken Ham was telling you about that are thought to have died out, in millions of years ago, except for just a few that are in different places. And so I'd been taught that in evolution. I thought they were very rare. And here I was, one of the first time I got to go to the Barrier Reef, by the way. I'm walking along with Ken Ham. We're supposed to get off the boat and go for a picnic. And I'm walking along, my wife is by my side, and I'm just looking at that water and all that stuff in there. And finally I gave all the stuff to Mary and said, I got to go in the water. I'll see you later. 5 hours. I had to swim back to the boat. I never got out of the water. And here I see these beautiful things underwater. And I said, well, wait a minute. No, they're not supposed to be here. There's supposed to be a few left in the deep ocean. Beautiful, brilliant. Could those be sea lilies, feather stars? So and there are a lot of fire corals down there that'll sting you. So I kind of backed into it. Sure enough, they're all over the place down there. Beautiful abundances of these things, just like they were at the very beginning. And then my personal favorite, this little critter right here. You got a lot of these all across the Midwest. Ohio is full of them, and Indiana and so on. This little animal called the trilobite. And this is the first animal to leave a real abundance of fossil remains, and it defines the lowest Cambrian rock and so on. These, I guess, remind you of a roly-poly or pill bug, one of those kind of things. And at the front here, they've got some eyes, and some of these are found preserved so well that we can shine light through these eyes and see how they focused. A simple animal. Even the prof from whom I learned evolution said, never let anybody tell you a trilobite is a simple animal. They have a double lens system to correct for underwater vision. So these see things as they really are. I told you about getting to lead students on field trips scuba diving to the Florida Keys. And I have to warn the students ahead of time, when you put on a face mask and go underwater, you're going to get a distorted image. Things are going to look bigger and closer than they really are. You're going to say, shark! And it's only shark. Okay? So don't worry about it. But the trilobite didn't have that problem. He saw accurately, handcrafted prescription lenses. And so God was the first one to make that. Scientists copied it years and years later before we developed the technology to do what God did for this, quote, simple creature there in earliest Cambrian rock. Now, there is a difference. Suppose you were able to go scuba diving when the trilobites were alive and compare what you saw then with what you see off the Florida Keys now, or even off the Great Barrier Reef. What would you say? Boy, look at all the evolution. Look at everything that's happened in the last 600 million years. There's so many new things, so many of this, so many of that. Wow, evolution is really wonderful. Exactly the opposite. If you were able to go scuba diving with the trilobites and then compared that with what you find in the oceans today, your response would be, what happened? Where did everything go? There used to be thousands of species of trilobites. There don't seem to be any left. There are a few trails that suggest there might be a few left somewhere in the deep ocean, but there used to be thousands of them. In the nautilus and the ammonites, those shelled squids, there used to be some as huge as tractor tires and so on, all kinds and sizes and shapes. And there's only the pearly nautilus left with a shell today and so on. All those beautiful lamp shells are brachiopods that litter the roadsides and road cuts in Indiana and Ohio and right across the Midwest and so on. Hardly any of them left today and so on. Instead of a record of upward onward progress, when you take a look at the fossils that we found at the very beginning and so on, with those same animals living today, it looks like a record of decline in size and variety. Not upward onward progress, but the creation of things well designed to multiply after their kind, followed by some kind of change and catastrophe that resulted in that decline in size and variety. The Bible tells us what that was, the fall and the flood that changed things for the worse, not for the better. Well, what do evolutionists say about that? They know these facts, that, like I say, Cambrian explosion is an evolutionary term. And my wife predicted a long time ago what they'd be saying about right now, and sure enough, that's what they're saying. So one of the ideas is, how do you explain the Cambrian explosion? Well, according to Francis Crick, who shared the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA structure, he knows that chemical evolution didn't happen on Earth, so what? It must have happened on another planet. Now, you've heard this story before. In a galaxy far, far away, long, long ago, molecules got together, life evolved on another planet into intelligent forms of life that did what? Packaged up the seeds of life, that's the title of his book, in the head of a rocket ship and fired it in our general direction, or it crash landed here, something like that. Seeded life from other planets and so on. That's why life began with this explosion. Well, at least that fits with the evidence a little better, although it's just pushing the problem back to another time and place. Well, other evolutionists would like to be more consistent, so they say dig deeper. The ancestors of those life will be found sooner or later in those Precambrian rocks down below. Well, one of the best to do that is Australia. And so in Australia, there's the Ediacara fossil beds in South Australia. And my wife and I have had a chance to go fossil digging in that very locality. And so these are supposed to be the oldest animal fossils on Earth, even older than those Cambrian ones. And here's a picture of the world's oldest animal fossil. Not this. This is my wife. Don't get confused. But here in her hand, back in our museum, is one of these Ediacara jellyfish. Nice impression of a jellyfish on the rock here like that. And it's not just a jellyfish. There are also segmented worms there. Earthworms, things like you think, well, gee, worms, aren't those fish bait? Not to a biologist, not to a scientist. An earthworm is really a fantastic thing. Do you know that they have a little two-hemisphere brain right up at the front? They've got 5 hearts. They've got a complete digestive system, little kidney-like things called nephridia, arteries, capillaries, veins, enormously complex animals. And there they are. The deeper you dig, what do you see? Simple beginnings? No. Separated kinds, well designed to multiply after their kind. As deep as you go, it still looks like evidence of creation. Those jellyfish may have something to say, too, about that second point. How fast do fossils form? Well, obviously, it would take millions of years to turn a jellyfish into a fossil, right? Well, think about that for a minute. There are a lot of jellyfish that blow in on shore occasionally down where we are in Florida and so on. Maybe you've seen them blow onto the shore. What happens in just a few hours, they're just a blob of jelly. They don't look like anything. You'd never be able to recognize what it was. If these things are going to form a fossil, the jellyfish has to land on a sandstone that acts as a natural cement. And that's how rocks form, by the way. It's just cementation. And so what you have here is some sand with the cementing agents in it and so on. And just like concrete, if you put your hand in at a certain time, it's too sloshy, no impression. If you wait too long, it's too hard and you can't put your handprint in it. But there's a stage where you can put your handprint there and it'll stay. And so even the evolutionists who discovered these things said these fossils must have formed in less than 24 hours. They had to land on that sand, leave that impression, had to harden up before the jellyfish dissolved. But he didn't mean less than 24 hours for one jellyfish. He meant the whole Ediacara fossil bed in less than 24 hours, a rock layer that runs 350 miles, nearly 500 from South Australia up into the Northern Territories. All that in less than 24 hours. A deposit, a flood deposit, near the middle of what's now one of the driest continents on Earth. And so to form fossils, you have to form them quickly or you don't form them at all. Think about fossil fish, for instance. Some of you have had the unhappy experience of having a fish die in an aquarium, and you've watched what happens. As soon as a fish dies, it sinks to the bottom and begins to turn hard like a rock, and a few days later you take out a fish fossil, right? No, not at all, is it? As soon as a hapless little critter dies, he floats belly up, and so on. The scavengers and bacteria begin to decompose it, and it disappears into nothing in a few days, unless you fish it out and give it a decent burial or so. And but you find fossil fish buried intact, the whole thing. In fact, you'll find schools of fish all oriented in a certain direction, and in more than one case, you actually find a little fish in the mouth of a big fish. And whoosh, the pair of them are buried so quickly, the little fish didn't have time to turn around and swim out, and the big fish didn't have time to swallow his meal. That's the kind of speed that we're talking about. They've got to be separated from the scavenger's current, wind and water that break them up and so on. I was on a talk show in Miami one time in talking about creation, evolution, and so on. And one caller called in, he says, I believe the earth has to be millions of years old. I've been out to the petrified forest in Arizona, and there are trees out there 2 meters across, great big huge logs that are turned into solid stone. He's right about that. We've been out there. I take the students past there. But then I said, well, now let's think about that a minute. You know, if a tree just fell over, you know, in a forest or in a lake or stream or a pond, and, you know, just laid there for millions of years, I said, you know, wouldn't the fungus eat it up? Wouldn't the bark beetles begin to get at it? You know, wouldn't it decompose? Wouldn't it just disappear and turn into nothing? I said, but what if it fell into, you know, some sediment that was rich in crystals that could crystallize into spaces and turn it to rock real quickly before things could eat it up and break it up, scavenge it, you know, tear it apart. Then it could be turned into a fossil and be preserved so we could see it today. You know what he said? Huh, I believe you're right about that. First instant convert I ever had. In fact, even evolutionists agree with us that fossils have to form quickly or they don't form at all. A lot of fossils are clams. Well, clams dig around in the sand, and so if you have, you know, according to evolution, about an inch every million years, how many fossil clams is that going to trap? They get bonked, hit on the head by a sand grain. It doesn't mean a thing to a clam. You can cover them with an inch of sand. Doesn't mean a thing. They dig out. You cover them with a foot of sand. They just dig right back out again. And so there are hurricanes now that rip through Florida too, rearrange the sand and so on and so forth, but don't form any fossils. The animals just dig out of that. And yet sometimes we find them as fossils buried so quickly that the animal, when it died, couldn't even open its shell. They're usually found separated on the beaches because the muscles, when they die, open up, the hinge rots away, and they're separated like this. By the way, my wife found a really intriguing clam in a shell pit down there in Florida. And it was an index fossil for the Miocene, supposedly 10 to 25 million years ago. But guess what? It still had some meat on it, some organic material. And we thought, hey, this is pretty exciting. You know, how could that hang around there for 10 million years? And so we took it up to the State Museum. We took a hand-delivered it. Okay, we didn't want to take a chance on losing this, and so we wanted to see what they have to say about it. By the way, the group up there has been very, very helpful. It's a great group of people to work with, even though we have a little bit of difference about how all this came to be. But we showed them, yeah, he said, this is a real mystery. And he showed us other examples of the same sort of thing. Well, it's a little hard to imagine that, you know, was saved for millions and millions of years. Even hundreds of years or thousands of years would be about the limit for preserving some of that organic material. So again, it looks like if fossils are going to form at all, they're going to have to form very quickly or they won't be preserved. But what about that harder problem? How about those rock layers, a mile, a kilometer and a half deep of rocks all over the place? You know, it's really awesome. Surely that much rock, that deep, spread out over all of what you see in Grand Canyon. Some of those rocks correlate with rocks that run right under where we're standing now, all the way across the continent, out into the Atlantic Ocean. Surely that would take a long time. And so evolutionists imagine that those rock layers in Grand Canyon were laid down by processes like we see going on today, as Ken said, the present is the key to the past. We see the Mississippi River, you know, washing sand and gravel and clay down to the Mississippi Delta. And when the river is flowing fast in spring flood stage and so on, the gravel's washed far out to sea. Then as the river slows down, sand is dropped where the gravel was. As it slows down later in the dry into summer and so on, then clay will settle out where the gravel was. And so if we're looking at slow, gradual process, what we'd expect to find would be a little gravel here, a little sand, a little clay, and you'd find clumps of rock, little lumps here and there, with really not much in the way of fossils in them. There may be the occasional fossil forming in the Mississippi Delta, but none have really been reported. And so a mixture of rocks, kind of like a swirl cake. Well, we actually see something like that in the inner gorge of Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon is really a double canyon. There's the sedimentary rocks full of fossils in the upper part, and then the little V-shaped slot where the Colorado River flows down below. And here we are standing down on that plateau looking across the inner gorge. And when you look over here, there's an area over here where there's some orangish red Hakati shale, it's called, a soft, crumbly rock that you can dig out with your fingernails. Well, here's a little lump of it here, and then it disappears. There isn't any all the way along here until finally there's another little clump of it over there. And there's several of these so-called Precambrian rocks in the inner gorge. A little clump here, a little clump there, not much in the way of fossils in any of them. And keep in mind, the flood was at least 1,600 years after the fall, and during that time, water would be flowing downhill, sand would be washing downhill, and there'd be little pockets of sand here, pockets of shale and mud over here, pockets of limestone over here, and so on. And not much in the way of fossils, a little clump here, a little clump there. That's the way the canyon ought to look if it were laid down slowly and gradually, like a big swirl cake. Hardly any fossils and rocks mixed up over short periods of time. But then the flood came, and that changed things dramatically. Instead of a lumpy cake, you get this layer cake, layers with the same kind of thing found as fossils over really broad areas. And when we take a look at the scripture, what's the first thing that happened in the flood? The fountains of the great deep burst forth. When I first went to the canyon, I went without really knowing. I hadn't really made up my mind yet between creation and evolution. Now, as we go back, I'd love to stake the place out with Bible verses all the way from the bottom to the top. And there, as we take a look at the biblical account of the flood, the fountains of the great deep burst forth. And so a lot of people aren't aware of this, but you know, when a volcano goes off, like Mount St. Helens or Mount Pinatubo, then this layer would be missing, then this layer would be back, and then all the layers would be missing. And so these layers down here, one slice can't really do justice to this. These are these rock layers that don't have much in the way of fossils in them, in that form here and there in little pockets. Well, those pre-flood rocks were tilted up on edge, and then the flood sediments began to enter the Grand Canyon area, and with tremendous force. I mentioned to you this Hakkatai shale, that orange-red stuff. It's so soft and crumbly you can dig it out with your fingernails. Well, here's the Chenoumo quartzite is exactly the opposite. It's so hard, you can hardly collect a specimen of it. I watched a geologist friend of mine bang, bang, bang with his hammer trying to knock a piece off this. All he got was a bird and beat-up hammer. The rock was harder than his hammer was, and so on. And yet when the flood came in, it swept through these things, it cut them off in essentially a straight line. Limestone, sandstone, shale, quartzite, just like a knife going through butter. Now, if that had happened slowly and gradually, Grand Canyon wouldn't look like this. And so, in fact, this came up at a debate in Australia one time. Somebody brought this up, and I thought, aha, the Lord has delivered him into my hands. And so he was talking about these tilted layers, but if they'd been tilted up slowly, what would happen? River and rain erosion and stuff like that. The Chenoumo quartzite would stick up in great big, huge ridges. The Hakkatai shale would be gone. It'd all be washed away. And there'd be channels like that. Indeed, as a geology student, we studied these so-called disconformities, these erosion surfaces, where you could see things like that having happened. But here it was so forceful with such great energy, it just cut through all of these things equally. Except on occasion, the Chenoumo was hard enough that it stood up even to some of the early flood stage waters. But the force of the flood was so great, it broke off boulders of this hard rock, lifted them up, didn't roll them along the bottom, lifted them up and carried them a suspended load for several miles and then dropped them away from the source. It's such a distinctive rock, it's easy to map and follow and so on. What size boulders am I talking about here? Well, one time I got to go on a field trip out into the desert with Dr. Austin and so on. Well, what's a biologist doing out there? Size marker and water boy. And so I get to carry the water and stand there and pose and so on. In this particular place, I've got my arm in the shadow of a big boulder directly over me here, and Dr. Austin was trying to get far enough away to get this whole boulder in the picture. And he just couldn't get far enough away without one lens to do it. That would easily fill up a large part of the front of this auditorium here. Those were the kinds of boulders that were picked up and moved by those flood currents down in the bottom of Grand Canyon. Well, what do evolutionists say about that? Well, as far as I know, absolutely nothing. They're labeled, they know they're there, but to my knowledge, and we checked this out a few years ago, there wasn't a single paper published by an evolutionist on the Tapeats boulders to explain how these big chunks were moved slowly and gradually by little raindrops and river erosion. They don't have a clue. You know, a lot of times you think, boy, you know, if you Christians could just believe in millions of years, you wouldn't have any problem with science. Well, if you believed in millions of years, you wouldn't have any problem with evolution, but you'd have lots and lots of problems with science. The whole canyon would be a mystery to you. How could this happen? How did those things get tilted? How did they get sheared? How did those boulders get moved? And several other problems we'll look at. So belief in a long time makes it easy to believe in evolution. Hard to believe what the science is telling us about Grand Canyon there. Well, as the flood began to deposit rocks there and so on, it continued to build up and just forgot all about evolution. One of my favorite areas in the canyon is this view here. It's just a pretty view and so on, and you can summarize a lot of things that we learn in going through the canyon. This little rock layer here, this major cliff, this is one thing that makes it hard to hike in and out of the canyon, this so-called red wall limestone. Now at noon, it doesn't really look like much, but in the morning or evening, in the morning, it's a brilliant orange red, and in evening it can be a deep, rich red and so on. And this is so-called Mississippian rock. Using the geologic column, this would be what evolutionists would call stage 5 in evolution. But underneath here is stage 1, Cambrian rock, the Muav limestone. Guess what's missing? Stages 2, 3, and 4, the Ordovician, Silurian, most of the Devonian. And so you ask, what happened? This was supposed to be a record of stages in evolution. And of course, evolution has to go in sequence. You can't go skipping from great-grandparents to great-grandchildren. You've got to have all those generations in between. Stage 1 has got to evolve into stage 2, 3, 4 before you can get to stage 5. And yet here are 3 big chapters ripped right out of the evolutionary story. Well, evolutionists know that, and they say, well, gee, I guess there was a lot of erosion. Must have erased, must have torn out those pages. Now, that's a legitimate hypothesis, because erosion often does erase part of the rock record. But you can test it to see whether it happened. If erosion erased 150 million years of evolutionary time, you better believe there's going to be a lot of stream channels, a lot of gouging, a lot of irregular surface, and all kinds of things. And so the evolutionists have gone looking for it, and they're honest enough to admit they have not found it. If they'd found the evidence of erosion there, they'd call that contact line between stage 1 and stage 5 a disconformity, an evidence of erosion. But they can't do it that way. The rocks are just smoothly right on top of one another, no evidence of erosion. If they wanted to be really honest, they just call it a conformity. Smooth, continuous deposition, 150 million years never really existed at all. But instead, they've come up with a term, para-conformity. It looks like a conformity. It looks like there was no break in time at all, but there's 150 million years missing. Gee, that's kind of a mystery. We'll file that one, see if we can figure that out a little bit later. Well, now, the first time I ever heard of paraconformities was in that book by Drs. Whitcomb and Morris, The Genesis Flood. And I thought, come on, that's crazy. You know, if the evidence were that clear, I mean, nobody would believe in paraconformities. They must be mistaken. That's when I was still mostly an evolutionist. So here I am now later as a student in this stratigraphy class, the rock layer class. And we're just going on talking about different contacts between rocks, angular unconformities, unconformities, disconformities. And then the prof said, and then there are paraconformities. You know, I perked up, really? You know, that's not just a word some creationist made up. And he said, these things are a real mystery. He says, it looks like there's no missing time at all, no evidence of erosion, but the fossils can be millions of years out of place. He said, how can that be? How can land just lie there for millions of years, neither depositing nor eroding, and then pick up right where it left off as if nothing happened? I thought, gee, that's a good question. And he didn't stop there. We had a field trip to go investigate a small paraconformity in Indiana in a quarry. 25 million years missing. We had an essay question on paraconformities on the test. Now, I got a little bold. I, defined paraconformity, described it, and so on. And I said, I think I'll just try some. I said, I think it's possible I might be able to explain these things. Now, this was a little bit, subdued and so on, but I said, somewhere these corals had to, originate. This was over in Indiana. So it looked like, maybe the corals lived a little longer here, and maybe the other corals started here first. And so all that happened was a minor ecological change. And so, currents buried animals from one environment, current changed direction, buried animals from a different environment directly on top of them. Well, I did get an A+ on the essay and all that, or on the whole test. And the process, interesting idea. But he said, I'm just not sure I'm willing to surrender half of 25 million years. I tried to split the difference, 12.5 million years. And notice, by the way, his belief in great age made it difficult for him to accept the facts that he could see and measure plainly. Isn't that interesting? Stephen Gould gets on to his fellow evolutionists for constantly looking at rock layers and coming up with ecological interpretations for what they see. And Gould, the evolutionist, says, quit doing that, the time scale's all wrong. Ecology happens in tens and hundreds of years, ecological succession. Evolution takes millions. You can't see ecology in the rock record. But the field scientists that are going out there looking for it, they see it all the time. Well, here's that magic paraconformity, that missing 125 million years. And these are the rule, not the exception, but the rule. They're all over the place. In fact, anywhere you go looking for fossils, you have to keep a guide with you because you can suddenly skip millions of years with no evidence that anything happened in between. Well, once the flood then passed that point, it just keeps going, stacking up rock like crazy. Uh-oh, shucks. Put the wrong thing in here, didn't I? Oh my, look at that. Oh shucks, there's a Coconino sandstone. Ooh, second big cliff down. It's a cross-bedded sandstone. That looks like a dune deposit. Oh gee, here I was trying to tell you this was all a flood deposit, and here's a huge dune right in the middle of the flood. How can you have a desert right in the middle of the flood? Oh gee, I'm sorry. Oh, Ken, forgive me. I guess, well, thanks. I'm glad I came. Well, what are you going to do when you run into something like that? By the way, you will. There'll be things that'll catch you off guard. Now, where does that fit? How can you have a dune in the middle of the flood? Well, you know, somebody asked me that one time at a meeting, how can you have a desert dune right in the middle of your flood? And I said, blah, 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 blah. I didn't have a clue. And so keep in mind, you know, we're finite. We don't know everything. You know, you got to run into some problems maybe you don't have the answer to. So I said, well, let me see if I can get back to you on that one. Well, fortunately, several people took a look at that. By the way, when you ask a creationist, like the folks out at ICR, a question like this, they take it seriously. Steve Austin takes it real seriously. Somebody asked him, how can you have a reef in West Texas buried right in the middle of the flood? How do you have time for that reef to grow? He took 2 years out of his life to study that and find out what was going on there. It turned out it wasn't a reef after all. And so we've done some study on this as well. Well, where else do dunes form? You know, you've seen pictures of dunes in the Sahara Desert and the desert in Southern California and so on. But dunes also form underwater. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you the bad news about these wonderful scuba diving trips I go on with the students. I don't know why. Every time we go, we get these huge seas. I keep praying. I don't know. I keep praying for placid seas, you know, about that high. That's enough wave action for me. I get sick on barges going across the Ohio. And so here we go, 5 to 7 foot seas, you know, and I've gotten sick on everything except my last dive. It's so wonderful, I still go anyway. But on one of these, wow, are the waves big. In fact, I told the dive instructor, I said, you're supposed to come up when you jump in and make this sign that everything's okay. I said, Jeff, I'm going straight to the bottom. Said, ship my body back to Mary if I don't make it, but I'm not bobbing up and down. So that's what I did. And down there at the bottom, you could see the waves 30 and 40 feet above you, you know, whipping shells and sand up into dunes underwater. And so dunes don't form just in deserts, they form underwater. Is there any way to tell which kind of dunes these are? Yes, there is. You can look at the character of the mineral that makes up the deposit. You can look at the angle of cross-bedding, and you can look at some footprints. It turns out that that layer is just laced with all kinds of animal tracks. How many animal tracks have been found in desert dunes? Not a one. They blow away. You need wet sand in order to set up and harden and preserve these kind of tracks. And even evolutionists have now had to admit the evidence really suggests that these are not subaerial dunes, not desert dunes, but submarine underwater dunes. So kind of keep that in mind. Keep in mind that in science there'll always be some new things. There'll always be different questions to ask and so on. But what's one thing you can count on? You run into a problem between the Bible and science, what do? Gee, I guess I've got to reinterpret the Bible. I've got to make it say something I never thought it said before. Oh, no. If you run into a problem between the Bible and science, hang in there. Science will eventually catch up with what the Bible said all along. I've seen it happen over and over and over again. The one is the eternal God, eternal word of the God who made everything. That's the one you can count on. That's the one that isn't going to change back and forth with man's ideas and so. Here's a picture, by the way, of my wife and one of our students looking at some of these animal tracks on one of the trails there. Well, last summer I had a special treat and coming back from Australia to hike that rock that Ken was talking about in the last section, that Ayers Rock. Right there in the middle of Australia, even got invited to take some pictures out the cockpit of the plane window as we were coming in and so on. And it really is an awesome structure out there all by itself. But as Ken pointed out, the one thing that you can be sure of is this did not form slowly and gradually millions of years ago. So you get to hike right up to the top, see all of this stuff out there and so on. And when you take a look at the kinds of grains, they're unsorted. When you take a look at the shape of the grains, they're all angular. Now, the evolutionists believe that these are worn off from the Flinders Ranges, where we did a lot of fossil hunting and slowly washed down streams and accumulated in the big pond that later on turned up on edge like that. Science says there's no way that could be so. If they took a long time and go down streams, then the grains would be rounded off. And when the streams are running fast, you'd get layers of coarser sand. As it slowed down, you get layers of fine sand. It looks instead like they got the right source, the Flinders Ranges, but it'd have to be sloshed over with a wave of water, breaking off big chunks and depositing it very rapidly in that area. And as Ken said, not very long ago, or it would have eroded down to the level of the plain and so on. And so when we take a look at the world round about us in Grand Canyon or otherwise, we see that these rock layers don't form slowly and gradually, but they form very rapidly instead. That's why they're layers. In fact, we even use flowing water to sort things out in layers. Flowing water is great at sorting things out into different layers. And the animals in those different layers belong to the same kind of environment. Environments don't even last for millions of years and so on. And so as we're looking at Grand Canyon, this giant layer cake, it really looks like a lot of water. The water of Noah's flood, perhaps. Not a lot of time. But that's only the layers. Now that we've got the layers, here we've got this giant layer cake. Who cut the cake? Where did the canyon come from? Well, one thing we know for sure, the canyon was not formed by the Colorado River. Even the evolutionists are pretty well giving up on that idea. Here's a view from the South Rim, looking down at the Colorado River as this little speck over here in the corner. And it's just lost in the vastness of the canyon. That's one problem. It's an underfit stream. It has an insufficient source of water to do the job that was laid out before it. There's another big problem. We were listening to a ranger talk one evening. I try not to jump on the rangers, overdo it or so, but we listen and just try to ask some polite questions. And she was talking about how this big, steep gradient from the Rocky Mountains down to the Gulf of California, 12,000-foot drop, that was the power that gouged out the canyon. And so we just asked her, well, there is a problem. Yeah, it starts up here at 12,000 feet, but then it flows down to 5,000, and the rim of the canyon is up here at 8,000. How'd the river get up on top of the canyon to start cutting? Oh, she said, maybe there's some books at the top of the canyon that will help you with that. Keep in mind, many of the rangers, by the way, don't believe what they're telling you. In fact, some of the rangers actually welcome questions. It gives them a chance to give their opinion. But they have to memorize these little speeches and so on and so forth. We've had that with rangers. That actually ask a question, and boy, they just open up. Turns out they're Christians too, and they're grateful for the opportunity to share some other ideas. But in order for the Colorado River to cut the canyon, it'd have to hack its way half a mile or 500 meters uphill to even get started at cutting the canyon. Instead, it looks something like this. The canyon isn't a lowland area. It's not a valley way down at the bottom of mountains. It's a gash and a huge regional uplift. The south rim of the canyon is over 7,000 feet above sea level. The north rim over 8,000 feet above sea level. So it's way up there. Do you know that the rim of the canyon is higher than the Great Smoky Mountains? It's higher than anything east of the Mississippi. And so here's this big wall of rock up here. And dammed up behind this big wall of rock is some leftover flood water. In fact, Dr. Austin and others have been mapping the water trapped behind this so-called Grand Canyon monocline. And you can actually see the shores of this. It filled up parts of northern Arizona, southern Utah, western Colorado, and so on. Here's this big lake of leftover flood water. And then what happened? Here, you have all of this dammed up and so on, and then there's a final push or an earthquake, something that triggers this event, and a breach opens in this thing. And the water rushes through that opening, carving the essential features of Grand Canyon very, very rapidly indeed. In other words, the canyon came first, the river came second. Now, if the evidence is that clear and simple as I'm suggesting it is, even scientists who are evolutionists would say, well, yeah, that makes sense in terms of other things that we know, and they do. Here's another example of the same thing. There's an area in the eastern half of the state of Washington, 25,000 square miles in the eastern half of the state of Washington, affectionately known as the channeled scablands. I'm sure the real estate developers have another name for it, but here's this whole great big area of basaltic lava flow, a lot harder than the soft sediment in Grand Canyon and so on, cut through with channels 900 feet deep that look like a giant braided stream and so on, cutting across here. Well, how do evolutionists explain that? Well, what they say is, and Harlan Brett's got geology's highest award, the Penrose Medal, for proposing and defending and documenting this explanation. A tongue of ice blocked off what we now call the Columbia River, dammed up glacial Lake Missoula, great big lake. This would be a post-flood catastrophe. Okay, same kind of idea, though, at Grand Canyon. A bunch of water trapped behind a dam like this, an area that filled the stem of Idaho and parts of Montana and so on, and then the ice dam broke, releasing all this water that raced across 25,000 square miles, cutting these channels up to 900 feet deep in 1 or 2 million years? No. 1 or 2 days, a day or two. This is a conclusion in a book put out by our own U.S. Geological Survey, The Channeled Scablands, the story of the Great Spokane Flood. It was my privilege one time to speak to a prayer meeting at the U.S. Geological Survey in Washington, talking about creation and the flood and so on. 25 professional geologists, all excited, enthusiastic Christians and creationists that are part of that research team there. And so the channeled scablands look like they tell the same kind of story that Grand Canyon does. Just recently, there's been a publication, they think they found the evidence of the biggest flood ever that evolutionists are willing to accept. A flood in Siberia on the Ob River that poured out more water in a short period of time than all of the river's oceans are presently doing right now. As Ken told you, one thing that was absolutely astonishing, there's a canyon on Mars 3 times bigger than the Grand Canyon. It's got all the features of the Grand Canyon. The side canyons, by the way, in Grand Canyon are laid out along earthquake faults, not slow tributaries trickling into the canyon. They come in, they're gashes, and they start abruptly like that. In fact, on the south side, we know it couldn't be slow river erosion because the south side slopes away from the canyon. Water would have to run uphill to make the canyons. But they just open up. They see that same kind of canyon on Mars, and sure enough, great flood on Mars. No liquid water, great flood. Here we're standing, 2 miles deep in water. Flood. I don't see any evidence of a flood. And yet it's all over. In fact, they'll even see it in some of these areas like the channeled scablands. And so it really looks like what we know there is consistent with what we see in our world. And then there's that fabulous example. You got to get Dr. Austin's video on Mount St. Helens. So my wife and I had a special treat. Last year we were out in Oregon in February, and we got a chance to fly in a little teeny plane with a Christian pilot right up the face of Mount St. Helens, all covered in snow. This was in February, and right up over the lip, down into the crater, right around the lava dome. You could still see it glowing red, and then out over Spirit Lake where all those trees were knocked down that I told you about. And then, this was the part that nearly took my stomach, right down the Little Grand Canyon of the Toutle River. And so Ken was showed some awesome pictures of that canyon with all those layers in there laid down very rapidly. And we know when that happened, the canyon wasn't there. And 5 days later, the whole canyon was there. Those layers that Ken showed you, in a complete miniature version of Grand Canyon, layers, side canyons, the works. A 1/40th size scale model of Grand Canyon formed in 5 days. And we got to see it happen. We got to see it happen. We have a faith that fits the facts. Doesn't mean we have the answer to every question that you can possibly ask. In fact, I'd kind of like to encourage young people, don't think that all of the research has been done. There are lots and lots of questions, lots of research projects that creation scientists are working on right now. There's lots of things we'd like to know more about in biology, geology, astronomy, and so on. And we hope some of you will be inspired, to get involved in this at a professional level, to go to school, become, scientists and so on that are able to work on some of these problems and communicate the truths of God's Word through the study of His world. But I do think we have enough information right now to answer those three questions with which we started. If you ask Grand Canyon, how did life begin, simple or complex? The stones cry out, so to speak. No way did life begin simple with a few forms thrown together by time and chance. It looks instead as if life exploded on the scene. Marvelous forms of life, well designed to multiply after their kind. What about those fossils? Were they formed slowly over millions of years? You can't even form fossils slowly over millions of years. They have to be buried quickly. Even evolutionists say that flood conditions are the ideal conditions for forming fossils. And what about those rock layers so deep and wide? Could they have been formed slowly like the Mississippi dumping sediment into the Gulf of Mexico? The Grand Canyon figuratively shouts back, not at all. If I was formed like that, I wouldn't look like a layer cake. I'd look like a swirl cake. Everything would be out of place. There'd be all kinds, not much in the way of fossils. Instead, it looks like a lot of water, not a lot of time, consistent with what we read in Scripture about creation, fall, and flood. Sometimes I've thought about it this way. You can imagine a geologist. He's been roaming around in Grand Canyon for 20 years. In fact, I wouldn't mind roaming around there for 20 years, trying to figure out what he sees and so on. Finally decides to take a break. So he hikes up out of the canyon, walks over to a bench to sit down, and there's a Gideon Bible. Okay, so he opens it right there to the beginning, to the book of Genesis. And he starts reading through that. And he says, that's it. Well, that's what I've been discovering all these 20 years walking around in Grand Canyon. When I take a look at the fossils that I found all over the canyon, they're always so well designed, and they look so much like the fossils that are the animals and plants that I've already seen, except there's so many more of them. It looks like I'm looking at evidence of creation, that living things were designed, well designed to multiply after their kind. That's why those fossils are so beautiful, so varied, so complex, all the way through the rock layers there. Evidence of creation. But of course, that's not the end of the story. What are those fossils? As Ken says, dead things. Okay, fossils are dead things. They don't just tell us about creation, do they? They also tell us about sin, about the fall, about death coming into the world. In fact, it's kind of sad, when you go to the canyon, it is beautiful. Beautiful colors and forms and so on like that, but it's a little sad too as we look at it as creationists. Really, you're looking into an open sepulcher, a graveyard, billions of dead things buried in rock layers, stretched out for miles right in front of you like that. You're looking into an open graveyard, a testimony to a tremendous death on a colossal scale. And that's what the Bible tells us about the fall and how death entered the world and what a terrible effect it had and how it grieved God to His heart that sin had ruined the world that God had created. In fact, the world got so bad that God had to destroy that first world with a flood to give it a fresh start with Noah and his family. It appears that the pre-flood peoples were on the verge of doing what we've been on the verge of, destroying the whole world without any hope of redemption. And so God steps in to give the world a fresh start with Noah and his family to erase that previous age. That's why those rock layers are stretched out in vast straight sheets over miles and miles all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean instead of being all jumbled up over short distances like the Mississippi Delta. That's why the fossils you find in a layer all come from the same kind of environment and so on. That's why you can skip 150 million years of missing evolutionary time and never skip a beat. That's why those boulders can be moved for miles because of the strength of the flood currents, how they can be tilted and sheared so quickly and so on. Creation, corruption, catastrophe. That's what you see there at the canyon. Well, that's the bad news. But if you want to hear some really bad news, you ought to hear evolutionists talk. One time, of course, evolutionists are popular guests on talk shows. And so I had a talk show. In fact, it came on right while I was having a biology class. And so I couldn't resist. I wheeled in the TV monitor and had these people listen to these creationists on the talk show. There were about 100 students in this class. And the evolutionists would say, I was standing at the back of the room, the evolutionists would say something, and 100 heads would all turn around and look at me because they'd say exactly what they said they did. Most of my students think I must be faking it. Surely they don't really believe that. But they did. And so the audience wanted to know, what does the future hold? What does the future hold? So they ask an expert on fossils, what does the future hold? He says, well, I hate to tell you this, but my study of fossils convinces me that all life forms eventually become extinct, and it looks to me like man, too, will one day become extinct. And the audience breaks into applause. We're all going to become extinct. Wow, that's really something to look forward to. Okay, then they asked Carl Sagan, the world's leading spokesman for evolution and so on. And he says, well, the only thing I'm sure of is next April on the cosmic calendar, the sun will expand, the earth will be incinerated, and life will be no more. The audience breaks into applause. If we don't become extinct, we'll all get incinerated and burned to death. Wow! Well, fortunately, we have a more lively hope than that, don't we? The fourth C in the sequence is the same as the first C. The God in Christ who is our Creator. This is John 1, isn't it? In the beginning was the Word, Logos, Christ. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And without Him was not anything made that was made. He was the Creator God. When our sin ruined the world that God created, we turned our back on Him. He didn't turn His back on us. He continued to care for us even when our sin caused us to be separated from Him. He was willing to die to pay the penalty for our sin, to conquer death, to raise us to newness of life. Now that's a message of hope that we can really share, isn't it? And the Bible tells about that wonderful time when Christ is coming again. One of my favorite passages in Isaiah. The wolf and the lamb will lie down together. A little child will lead them. They'll not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, but the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That's the message that we have to share with the world. A much more lively message than that message of death finally wins that the evolutionists offers. From the evolutionists started from nothing, just a big bang, dead universe produced life temporarily, and death wins. But according to the Bible, life, the life of God produced the universe. Death is a temporary intruder, and in Christ, death is conquered, life wins. That's a message that we can all share. The message that we can see in God's world, a message that agrees with what we read in God's Word. So when we take a look at Grand Canyon, when we take a look at the things that we've talked about in the seminar today, it's not just a science lesson. I'm sure you would see that clearly. We see some of that promise of resurrection right there in Grand Canyon as you see the beautiful plants begin to reclaim that sterile mineral earth. So as the sun goes down on Grand Canyon, we might think about the conference and so on. It's not just science. There's a spiritual lesson here. And I have to admit, that's one of the thrills of having students on that camping trip. Not just the science, but that close spiritual fellowship. And what a tremendous witnessing opportunity. As we stand there with the rocks of Grand Canyon, I'm not a really bold person generally, but even me, at that time, I speak loud enough so passerbys can hear. And you'd be surprised how many people are slogging. Come out, what's this? You know, I even get invited to speak at universities sometimes because there are other schools, you know, telling quite a different story about Grand Canyon are there. What a wonderful opportunity. As our theme has been, what we see in God's world agrees with what we read in God's Word. And don't you be afraid to share it. Some people have come, well, if I was talking with a young lady, we've got a lot of professors and a lot of teachers in our church. You know, what can I do? Okay. God has made wise the simple. Think of that professor at San Francisco State University. People just shared some books with him. If you don't feel comfortable doing it yourself, just hand him some material, point him in the right direction and so on. And then stand back and let the Spirit of God make them new creations in Christ. That's one bit of evidence of creation we can all share, can't we? How God changed us from death to life.
Well, that concludes our presentation. And one more thing, that's to tell you about Creation Magazine. It's the easy way for your whole family to stay up to date on creation and evolution. Creation Magazine is your family's vital defense against all those evolutionary textbooks, nature shows and magazines that abound today. 56 pages of full colour with no paid ads are sent to your home 4 times a year. Subscribing helps the message to keep on expanding as you're able to share this exciting material with others. Once again, thanks for joining us, and if you have any questions, contact us direct.